Erica not joining us, Paul?
Unfortunately, Erica's not able to join us this week. She's very busy, which is a good sign.
Yeah.
So asked if I could just chair the session for this week. So good morning, everyone, and welcome. I thought this week what we would do is just continue the themes that we started over the last couple of weeks around the tutor assessed grading for functional skills, and talk about endpoint assessment and what's happening there. Unfortunately, Linda is not able to join us this morning, or Jackie, so we won't have an endpoint assessment perspective there. But if there's any updates anyone wants to give, or any queries that anyone has that you'd like us to probably take away, then please raise them. And then also just to talk about, obviously, again, the update on the lifting of restrictions and what that means for each of us as providers, and what our plans are in terms of re-engaging, if that is the case, face-to-face delivery, and what challenges that presents to us. So shall we start with functional skills? Christine, have you got any updates for us in terms of functional skills and tutor grading and so on?
No, not really. I think I've been noticing that some of the larger awarding organisations keep sending out guidance. The window is open now so that people can start submitting their CAG grades. I just think people are beavering away and trying to make sure everything's in place that needs to be. It's one of those situations that, as we talked a lot about it last week, it needs to be managed really carefully, because there is only going to be one opportunity. There's no right of appeal, and the evidence needs to be really strong. And providers like yourself, Paul, that have got more than one awarding organisation that they're actually managing, then that is an increased challenge, because there's different sets of requirements with different awarding organisations. There does seem to be a little bit of a grey area around some of the ongoing tests, because it is being seen as best practice if people can still be tested. There has been things done around invigilation to be able to make that easier to still carry on. But there seems to be, certainly with Pearson, you can't test within this certain window. And as I mentioned last week, the problems that can then cause for people who want to get their learners tested but lose this vital 2 weeks because of, contract end. But it's quite important, I think, that as long as that there has been the flexibilities around EPA, that as long as there is some evidence to say that the maths and English has been passed, then they're accepting that. But I think there is that concern that if a provider is putting in an estimated grade for a pass, which could be a borderline pass, and then the awarding organisation maybe kicks it back and it becomes a fail, and that person's gone for endpoint assessment, what are they going to do then? So I think that's another one of those things. We'll just have to see what happens when we actually get to that place. And there's still an awful lot of that around. But I just think it's really, really important to make sure that every learner that's in that window from the 20th of March to the 31st of July that is going to be having the estimated grades goes forward in that claim, because otherwise that's going to open up other issues. But yeah.
Absolutely, Christine. And Christine, from what you understand, I know City and Guilds, for example, announced that they would be releasing the grades on the 31st of July, which is the last day of the academic year. Is that consistent with awarding organisations? Is there a common theme there, or do they all have their own dates?
Well, the guidance that was coming out was that it's expected that most grades will be received in line with the A-level and GCSE results.
Right.
And I think there's a strong encouragement that it is no later than the 21st of August, which is when the GCSE results would come out. And that's in order to make sure that any learners who are relying on those results in order to be able to then go forward with something else, maybe a new college course in September, or something that they're planning to start in September, they're looking that isn't going to be held up. And so I think really it's going to depend on how quickly the awarding organisations think they can turn it round, get it back out to centres. I think City and Guilds is much more apprenticeship, employer, work-based learning focused, whereas the likes of Pearson, AQA, they're more exam focused because they do a lot of work in schools. So I get a feeling that they're probably going to have everything sitting in a similar kind of process, whereas more sort of smaller organisations and more work-based focused organisations might release theirs quicker.
So from the point of view of achievement rates, because providers will obviously be concerned that
Absolutely.
there's going to be an impact on their in-year achievement rates. With City and Guilds announcing, for example, the 31st of July, my initial thought was, well, if you prepare your ILR submission on the basis of the results that you have submitted, the likelihood is you would hope that there are going to be far fewer changes. So therefore, rather than waiting and then submitting your full ILR, if you have your ILR ready, you've then still got those sort of 5 days before submitting. To enable you to do that, I suppose the other option though is to wait for those results, and then you've got your R13 and R14 returns to put in. But I'm sure that there's many providers, either for standalone or for apprenticeships, that will be worried about the impact that it's having. So again, is there anything from DFE or the ESFA around the acknowledgement that there may be an impact on achievement?
I haven't seen anything as yet. Whether something will come out in the next couple of weeks. The only thing I would say really is if you've got, because the recommendations that seem to be quite strong is that where you've got fails and strong passes, then the concerning area is those in the middle. So if you've got apprentices that you know is a strong pass, and really, and we haven't had much time to do it, but really the preparation for learners to get to that point and the evidence to support that a learner is a strong pass is almost, you don't have to worry about them. It's those in the middle. And I think it might be a judgment call on maybe you have a thinker, through standardization, you're going to have some possible bandings or rankings with the learners that do sit in that borderline bracket, and maybe take some kind of judgment call on, okay, so if we've got 60% that are sitting in the top end and 40% that are sitting in the bottom end, if we think, okay, so 60% of our borderlines should come back as a pass, then we'll use those figures along with our strong passes. And then if we have to make an adjustment, that might be a way to think going forward, to make some kind of judgment on those borderline numbers of where you feel it might sit.
Can I ask a question? Do people think that the awarding bodies have really worked together during this crisis? Because I've been contacted quite a few times by people are finding different information coming from different awarding bodies, and it's quite conflicting in times.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges with that, Lindsay, that each awarding organisation has got their own way of approaching this. They're all working under the AOC, the Federation of Awarding Bodies. They've put out a guidance that they all need to be working towards. So within that broad boundary, they will be sitting within that. But there's so much wriggle room in that, the window opened on the 1st of June. They can access those to put the results in. There's a 3-week opportunity for awarding organisations to be able to decide what boundaries they're having. Some have got wider boundaries than others.
Yeah.
So it's just very much getting the clarification from the awarding organisation and working to what they're asking for. Because if you look at what everybody else is asking for, then it starts to get really confusing, and there isn't time to do that.
Yeah, it just come on my desk quite a few times. People have said they don't know which is the best. Should they go, you know, because of the difference of approach. And, you know, and poor Tom, he's more interested in his radio show than needing, you know, I mean, it's all very confusing for the sector at this time. They haven't been.
I think they can't think about which awarding organisation are we going to go with at this stage. We've gone past that.
Yeah.
Because the learners will have already now had to have been registered for functional skills with the awarding organisation, and if they're not, that's it. There's nothing that can happen.
Actually, City and Guilds extended by a week, didn't they? So City and Guilds is actually 5th of June, so it's this Friday.
Yes,
so there is still that tiny bit of a window this week. If there's anyone who hasn't been registered, it would be to put them through with City and Guilds. And they've got a longer window, haven't they, as well, because their submission is right up to the 26th rather than the 19th. So
and they're also
sort of moved it by a week for some reason. So again, like you were saying about not having that standardized approach throughout, actually that is just one of those examples.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, the really like I say, I can't overstress it's which there's no choice of awarding organisation now, not for this particular situation. You are with the awarding organisation that you are with, and you need to work within those parameters. It really doesn't matter what anybody else is doing at this stage. The focus has to be with the learner, getting those grades in to make sure that they're not disadvantaged by this whole situation. What happens afterwards, and looking at the different awarding organisations and what they're offering and maybe considering changes, that's a different issue altogether. But for this purpose, you have to stick with where you are.
That's a really good point, Christine. And but equally, Lindsay, it's a really good question. And it is clear that each awarding organisation is working independently. And I guess there is guidance that they have to follow. But equally, each of those awarding organisations then has to look internally. So they will be of varying sizes. They will have varying sizes of cohorts of learners registered for functional skills that they need to deal with. And then they'll have to look at what resource they have available. That doesn't help us as providers, because we have to, so for us as an example, we've got a number of awarding organisations we work with, and each one has different windows, has different deadlines, has different criteria that we have to meet. But all that we can do as a provider is read the guidance, interpret the guidance as best we can, and make sure, as Christine pointed out, that we evidence our decision making and our process as best we can, and make sure that we meet each of those deadlines. But,
of course, it's not just functional skills. This opportunity to enter the assessment, the average grades or the estimated grades or whatever you want to call them, the CAG as they're using the technical name, if you like, it's for every vocational and technical qualification that fits in this bracket. So for some organisations, some awarding organisations, they're potentially going to be dealing with huge things like BTECs and you know, the other kind of vocationally related qualification that sits in this space. And so they'll have tailored their whole approach to that. Functional skills is just part of it.
Okay, thanks very much, Christine. And
okay. I'll shut up now.
No. So any other questions or any other issues that anyone wants to raise around functional skills or CAG, as Christine quite rightly points out that they're referring to?
No, I think one of the questions that we've put forward is still, as we were discussing last week, how are people actually going to not just put forwards the ones who've passed, but all of the fails as well. And there's a list of, you shouldn't present a learner if you haven't got enough evidence, but if you've got enough evidence, and you think they failed, then you should still put them forward. And I just think I can see where they're coming from in terms of quality assurance. They want to see the whole range of grades, but there's so much to be done in the next 2 weeks that I would rather concentrate on the learners who've passed, and the ones who failed actually not spent all of that time and putting them on the CAGs, etc. So it's not it's not a graded qualification, it's pass or fails. So I think having that range maybe doesn't apply in the same way in some sense. And also, like we said last week, with the reform having come in, there isn't actually a previous benchmark that would indicate whether that provider was working within the same sort of benchmark as they had the previous year. So not sure what you all think about it, and are you putting learners who would have failed maybe at first try, or are you waiting and working with them further and then wait for the next sort of when they can go back into centre and take their exams, for instance, in January, and be invigilated in centres, for instance?
Oh, there's a few things there, Barbara, so I'm going to unpick them one at a time. So the window is 20th of March until the 31st of July, and that is for any learner that we would have tested in that period. If they have been tested and you've got results and you're not putting them through for the estimated grading, then you don't need to worry about them, because those results should be in the system to help to support the overall success rates and pass rates of the provider. If you've got learners that haven't taken that testing opportunity to either gain a pass or a fail, and they are in this window of learning of testing, it's so important that you submit your fails as well as your passes, because if you only submit your passes, you're going to skew your pass rate achievements. And yes, with the reform, there isn't the historical data, but there is the historical data on the legacy. And if you don't have enough fails, you could end up with some people that might have passed, not passing because your results are too high on passes, if that makes sense. And that again is going to impact on the results that you can put through on your achievements for the year, because people that you would have expected to get through might not get through. It's such a grey area.
I do get that, but in real life, if a learner had taken an exam in March and failed, yes, I would have worked with them and they would have done a reset in June, for instance. Whereas in this occasion, I've only got one window, haven't I? And that doesn't sort of allow me then to keep working with some of those learners. So I think that's where that grey area is, I think, in terms of pass rates. Because
no, I think if you've got a learner who's failed in March, and that's in this either just before or in this time frame, and you were working with them to expect them to resit in June, yeah, then you should have the evidence to support that they would have passed. So that should be no different as being under normal circumstances. So you probably would have done things like sample assessments to make sure that they were ready to retake.
That's right, practice papers, etc. Yeah,
and as long as you've got the results on those practice papers that they have achieved what's necessary, and you've got some information to support the development from the original fail to how they could now achieve a pass, then that is your strong evidence to validate that learner is a pass.
Absolutely. No, and that's exactly what we've been doing, but I'm still not completely clear about that benchmark, because in normal circumstances, people can take the functional skills exams more than one in a quarter to make sure they would have passed it before their EPA, etc. Whereas in this instance, it's why would I work with the ones who might not have achieved? I might just say, actually, I need more learning with them, so I'm not going to present them as fail. I'm just going to carry on the learning that they need until they're ready to then take the exam, if you see what I mean.
But you should have put in some, you should already have entered the learners that you're expecting to put in for these CAG grades. So if you weren't expecting to be testing a learner in this window from March to July, then you wouldn't have put them in as being a grade. It's really everybody on your list who you said you're going to submit grades for, because that list, that sort of, if you like, that provisional list should have been entered, then you just need to infill the grades against all the people that you've said you're going to be claiming for, which whatever it would be, whether it would be a pass or a fail.
Yeah, I think just to reiterate the point, Christine, absolutely right. The awarding organisations have been really clear in terms of how they will, if you like, audit the process. And one of the red flags that they've highlighted is if a centre has gone from an achievement rate of, let's say, for example, 80%, and then all of a sudden they go to 100%. In other words, all of the learners they submit are passes, are based on their grades, then that's going to be a red flag. So it's trying to manage that process so that it doesn't, raise that flag for you as an organisation, where then the awarding organisation may then start to question or feel they have to question why all of a sudden all learners are passing. But equally, Christine, I think what I was picking up from Barbara's question, which is quite legitimate in terms of the circumstances, if you have a learner, and let's take Barbara's example, who perhaps had a test, didn't pass first time, you're doing more work with them, but you still feel that, and they were due to be, within this window, but you don't feel they're ready, so we don't want to set them up to fail. What should you do in that circumstance with that learner?
I would say the quickest fix to prove the fail. So it might be that you get them to do an initial assessment or a diagnostic that maybe shows that they're not at that level yet, or maybe get them to do, if it's in English, maybe if they could do the writing or reading component as a sample paper, and then that proves that they didn't get the pass, because they need all three components of the English to be able to pass. So really, if they fail one part, then there's no point in putting through an assessed grade for them because they can't get the qualification. So each learner is going to be an individual case. It may well be, if you know from working with a learner from the maths perspective, Barbara's talked a lot about City and Guilds, so I'm assuming that they are predominantly with City and Guilds.
No, we're not actually. We were with NCF. Well, we are City and Guilds and NCFE and Pearson actually. So we've got three.
Oh gosh, you have got a headache there, haven't you? So yeah, but from the City and Guilds perspective, they've got three clearly defined parts within a paper. So they've got task 1, task 2 and task 3, and each relates to either number, measure, shape and space, or handling data. So if you know that your learner is weak in a particular area, you could maybe just get them to do that assessment. And if their marks are really low for that part, that then could be, help to justify the fact that they're not ready yet, so they would be a fail. So at least you can put some kind of grade against them without doing too much work.
Yeah, and I think that's the sort of tricky part, isn't it? I know the learner's not ready, so why would I tell that learner they failed when actually I can just carry on the learning with them until they are ready? And it's a bit like having to force learners through the functional skills level 2 for those apprenticeships at level 2, etc., which has been lifted. And I feel we're into that same sort of category a little bit. I've got to tell learners they failed. Well, when they do get the results, because I'm not telling them now, obviously, but when they do get the results, they will see a fail, when actually, hand on heart, I could have just carried on working with them and they would pass a little bit. And, what does it do for learners themselves and their motivational, the motivational side of the learning is that I've actually presented them when actually I knew they weren't ready.
Well, I think
where I'm coming from.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the way that I would deal with that, Barbara, is that you must have something that lets you know that they're not able to pass. And so I would use that as a basis for saying why they can't pass. And just say to the learner, look, things are really, really strange at the moment. And we are in this process where we have to put a grade in for you because we thought you might be ready to be tested. We don't feel that you're ready at this stage, and under normal circumstances, we wouldn't have been putting you in for a test. So we have to record a grade against your name. So we're going to record a fail, but that doesn't reflect that you have actually failed. It's just a paper exercise. We will put you in for a test, when we feel that you're ready. And that will then go a little bit later on. And also, you know, when all this grading has been finished, then in July there should be opportunities for you to be able to start testing learners again, so that if they did get the pass, it's not going to hold them back in any way. And you wouldn't necessarily need to let them know about the fail then, because they've got the pass, which would override the fail anyway.
Okay.
Thank you.
Really interesting stuff, and I think it can be, you know, quite complicated for some centres, and clearly, Barbara, you've got some decisions to make there. If we just conscious of time, if we move on to endpoint assessment now, I'll briefly just give you an update from my perspective. I spoke over the last couple of weeks about my frustration with one of our endpoint assessment organisations effectively being incommunicado. We had a response from them on Monday, and basically that response stated that they are now in conversation with the Institute, but they don't anticipate being able to give us an update for a further 4 or 5 weeks, which is very frustrating. But all we can do is forward that communication on to the employers. The further frustration is that they are the only endpoint assessment organisation for that standard, so we don't have any other option at this stage. So that's my update. That's only on one endpoint assessment organisation that we work with, by the way. Others that we work with have been very supportive, as I mentioned previously. Does anyone else have any updates in terms of endpoint assessment organisations and their approach to endpoint assessment during this time, or any issues that they are suffering as a result? I'm going to take that as a no. We'll just keep that topic open each week. So if anyone does have any issues regarding endpoint assessment, then by all means just raise that, but we'll keep our eyes on any further updates that are coming out around endpoint assessment. The next topic or theme that we said that we wanted to cover today was in terms of the lifting or relaxation of restrictions and recent announcements. And DFE themselves announced that if providers and employers working together are able to deliver directly face-to-face on premises, then they should work towards that. But if not, then providers should continue to support remotely in whatever ways they are able to. So a question to everybody: what approach are you taking, and what, if any, challenges are you facing in terms of re-engaging face-to-face delivery with your employers and learners?
Sorry, can I just come in on this to start with, because this has happened with this week. I was supposed to go to a client tomorrow. The client was very open for me going. There's lots. It's a private sector company. It's a factory. They've put all the safety measures in place. They've had staff back in work since last week, and I was going to deliver to 2 small groups, so we were able to social distance, etc., etc. This is an associate program that I'm doing, so it's not my client. It's a client for another training organisation. When I let them know that I was going to do that, they said that the guidelines are still saying that I can't go in face to face. And she quoted, was it the ESFA guidelines on the government guidelines are saying that at the moment, this is what she quoted to me. I thought it was different if the employer agreed that we can't deliver face to face. So I got a bit confused with it, really.
So, I mean, I can certainly double check, see if there've been any further updates. The update that I'm referring to relates to education, and it was primarily focused, and I can certainly send that out. It was primarily focused around schools, so primary schools and secondary schools, but it does say within that this may apply to apprenticeship delivery as well. And then there are...
Yeah, sorry, Paul. I asked her about that, and she said she was quoting the bit that she said because it's they come under education, if you like. She said it was still counted, but I didn't think she was right. But she said she'd found some guidance that said that the government was saying at the moment that we couldn't. So it would be helpful if you think there's different guidance out there.
Yeah, absolutely. So what I'll do is I'll find it, Sue, and then I'll share it in the group.
Okay.
There was definitely something in FE Weeks come out just at the beginning of this week to say apprentices, not just age 16 to 18, but also 19 plus, can now resume learning from the 15th of June.
So from the 15th of June, not now?
No, it was from the 15th of June.
Sorry, Barbara, where was that? What was that guidance from?
It was from in FE Weeks. It was just literally at the beginning of this week. I can put it on the...
Okay, great.
Thanks.
That might be helpful then.
So we need to clarify first the guidance, and then we need to clarify from which dates it sounds like, Sue, that you're do that from. But and this is the issue that we're all facing is the updates that are coming out and interpreting those updates. But equally, as a provider, you have to make a decision that's right for you and your organisation and your staff. And equally, then you need to have a conversation with the employer, who separately have to make a decision for their organisation and their staff. And it's only where both are in agreement that can take place from whatever date we're being told we can do that. So I guess my question to everyone is what challenges, if any, are you facing? What conversations are you having, if any, with your employer base at the moment in terms of when and if and when you can resume face-to-face delivery? Or is everyone at the moment happy to continue with that remote delivery and that remote support in whatever guise that is for the foreseeable future?
Sorry, then, if I can come in a minute, because I just didn't think anybody else was. Because two of my contracts are public sector, they're being, from what I can see, more cautious than private sector, who, like the company I was supposed to be going to tomorrow, had furloughed staff. They've brought them back off furlough. They've got up and running. And one of my contracts is with Wirral Borough Council, so it's obviously a massive employer. They've said they want to do individual risk assessments for every member of staff before they bring any face-to-face training back in. So I don't know how long. I've been given no guidance as to how long that would take. Therefore, I'm doing remote sessions next week for them, because again, I thought we would be back up and running in June. What's interesting is the individual learners and the individual learners managers are okay with it. It's from an organisational point of view, they've said that at the moment they want to do, because individual departments have done risk assessments, because there's some departments within the council who are back in work. They're back in the offices. I'm doing some work for Mersey Tunnels, and they're back in now as well. So there seems to be a bit of a disparity between what overall as an organisation they're saying and what individuals within organisations are saying. So, but at the moment, the feedback I'm getting from the two public sector clients that I'm working with is until we do a full COVID risk assessment, there's going to be no face-to-face training.
So, Paul, if I could just come in there. So I just want to say, so I'm about to start a new position with the NHS, and when I spoke to my new line manager, and we'll be working in apprenticeships, she says that the NHS are doing individual risk assessments on every individual, every member of staff. So it's going to really affect, it could be that certain learners can have some delivery, but others won't be able to have any for quite some time. And they are, really sort of going down the route of how people are getting to work, not only the environment that they're working in when they get there. So I think for the public sector, they certainly seem to be taking a lot more of a rigid approach, I would say.
I think, Sarah, as well, what the difference has been, obviously, because Wirral Borough Council is a massive organisation. I don't necessarily think departments are talking to each other, because, as you say, a lot of the departments have done individual risk assessments because they brought people back in. So presumably those same risk assessments would be the same whether they're working in a department with somebody or whether they'd be working with me face to face. But
Yeah.
as an organisation, they're saying, no, they've got to, I don't know how they're going to collate all of that information to say. And they were talking about putting together a questionnaire that we're going to send out to everybody. But I don't think really one department's talking to another about what risk assessments have been done.
No, I've been told that, you know, I will not be working full time in the office for a very, very long time to come. She says, yeah, she said to me that even going, you know, we can do all sorts of things. She says, but you know, you might be in 1 day a week, you might be in 2 days a week. You're not going to be back. You're not going to be full time in the office. No one is for a very long time. So I think it's really going to have an impact on who the learner is, I think, to be fair.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks, Paul.
I guess the positives, and I thank you, Sarah. I guess the positives there are at least you're both having the conversations with the organisations. So that's the conversation has started. The fact that they have to undergo individual risk assessments, again, I think is a good approach.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, our responsibility from a safeguarding and health and safety perspective in terms of our learners, if the employers are doing that, taking that approach, then that's really positive.
Yeah.
Equally, as providers, we need to be doing that for our own staff as well, and it's that sharing of information and that interaction that's going to help. The other point is with large organisations like Wigan Borough Council and the NHS, Sarah, is hopefully you'll have points of contact who oversee, you know, apprenticeship provision.
Yeah.
And I guess they're your conduit in terms of understanding, because you're right, Sue, that you're going to have different departments that work in different ways, but different timelines, etc. So I guess all you can do is use your point of contact.
Yeah.
But in the meantime, it sounds like the fallback position is status quo. It continue delivering as you are at the moment until such a time as that changes, either organisation-wide or, as Sarah pointed out, on an individual basis, and therefore you react and you do as best you can around that. But I think that the important point to make there is this isn't a one-sided conversation.
Mm-hmm.
So don't rely just on the employer. I think keep the employer updated about what you were doing as a provider and your timelines and your expectations around how you're going to deliver. Because I think that's really important, that you're giving them the message that this is what we foresee for the next, whether it's, you know, month or 3 months or whatever. And just keep them updated, because that may influence their approach in terms of their risk assessments and their timelines and so on.
Yeah. I think it's probably going to change again from the 15th of June, because obviously from there we've got other, hopefully the lessening of more restrictions. As Barbara mentioned before, if the signs are maybe education is looking to say that you know apprenticeships can come back into more face-to-face training. So I think because that's the next update, I think that's likely to be, maybe they're waiting for that and they'll get some clearer guidance then.
Yeah, absolutely, Sue. And I think what we're doing as an organisation is we're separating existing learners, so existing apprentices, and how we support those versus new business and new starts. And you're absolutely right with the lifting of restrictions for like non-essential retail, etc. From the 15th. And thereafter, I think in the beginning of July, they're talking about reviewing hospitality and so on. I think you'll start to see that, and I think that's going to have potentially a more positive impact on new starts.
Yeah.
Again, it's how are you going to work with those organisations in terms of engaging those new starts. So certainly our strategy at the moment is separating the two. So existing learners, what's our approach? What's our communication to our employers and learners in terms of that approach? And then with new business, again, it's, you know, if you've got a pipeline of employers and those employers have got it on hold at the moment, how long for? But also have the conversation, okay, restrictions are still in place. What's that engagement likely to look like? Can that still be remote, or will that have to be face-to-face? Because that's going to impact your business going forward in terms of new starts if you can't meet those requirements. So I think there's two separate conversations to be having with your existing employers and potential employers going forward.
Yeah, I think you're right, and we have been having those conversations, because things like inductions, etc., they very easily fit into the remote Zoom, etc., and getting paperwork done and all of that type of thing. So we have been talking about, but again, one of the problems is Wirral is one of them. They've got quite a few learners who want to come onto program, but at the moment they're not putting any on until they do these risk assessments.
Yeah,
it's such a fine balance, isn't it? It's almost like walking a tightrope, because you've got the employers who've got some staff furloughed and some not. Even those who are starting to come back are not coming back in the same way that they were before. Where people can work at home, they're still being encouraged to work at home as much as possible. So that will then cause you a problem with how much contact you can have with those people. And there's all the people that you want to see. Can you, if you do want to do a session, can you actually get to them all at the same time? Because are they actually in that workplace? And
Yeah.
then from the other side as well, as the provider, it's like how you balance, you know, because you could have some staff who can't do certain things right now, or, you know, you need to think about where they're traveling to. If you've got some assessors who travel a long way and stay away a lot, they can't do that. So how can you accommodate that? There are just so many factors to consider. It's a nightmare at the moment, I can imagine.
Yeah, it was interesting because the session I was supposed to be doing tomorrow was actually in Kidderminster. Now that's a 2.5 hour drive for me.
Yeah.
And normally I'd stay over. But what we decided to do was do a sort of a slightly condensed version of 11 till 3:30. So I could actually, you know, I wasn't getting up at ridiculous hour to travel to, I mean, it's not going ahead now anyway, they because of the, as I say, they pushed it back. But yeah, that's what, as you say, but Christine, that's what I was going to have to do, because they're all local, but I travel to them, and of course, I usually stay over, and there's no hotels open. So.
No.
Yeah, and again, yeah, really good point raised, Christine, because the other factor, the other sort of dimension to all of this is what we're assuming is that it may return to as was before. So in terms of our delivery, in terms of the employer, the learners, etc. But what happens if actually the learner says, actually, I really like this way of delivery. I prefer this to the face-to-face. It works better for me. And then the employer says, well, we don't mind how it's delivered. You know, there may be a request to you to say, actually, can we continue with this remote delivery because it's far more effective, it's far more beneficial, it's far more flexible, accessible, etc., etc. So you know, that's something else to consider.
Yeah, it's interesting because, and I have to say, without exception, and this is not for new starters, because obviously they've got no experience and nothing to base their experience on. But all of my existing programs have said Zoom is great for one-to-ones and for coaching and whatever, but we prefer to get in the same room when we're doing delivery. Without exception, all of them have said that.
Right. Which
is interesting.
So even there, it may be it's some form of blended approach going forward.
Yeah.
Might work best. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. It's 10:51. Any other questions or any other points anyone wants to raise around changes to delivery models or challenges that lifting of restrictions may pose?
Just that we're looking at doing all of the risk assessments for our centres across the country. We're not sure exactly when we're going to open them until it's safe, etc. But definitely considering opening parts of some centres in July where some exams can take place. So actually not using them for delivery, but actually to facilitate exams. For instance, we're doing accounts AAT, and they've only got some windows in July, certain dates, etc. So it would be just, you know, facilitating that for learners where it can be invigilated in the normal way, obviously with social distancing, but that's one of the considerations as well. Are we reopening for learning, or are we at this stage reopening just for certain learners to take their exams, basically?
Yeah, really good point again, Barbara, because that's you know, we as an organisation also, we've looked at all of our premises, and you know, do we need, are we going to utilise those premises during lockdown, and if so, what for? All of our staff are working remotely, so we haven't been using any of them. But then, yes, absolutely, as we go forward, what do we use those premises for? Do we need those premises, ongoing? And again, I think that's going to be one of the considerations for providers going forward in terms of what their from an operational perspective, what their operations are going to look like physically, and how they're going to adapt going forward. Because I don't want to be, I certainly don't want to end on a negative note, but the thing that we've all got to consider, and this is providers, this is employers, is learners, is that we're assuming that we're now coming out of and will continue to come out of. What we do need to, and it has to be, in terms of our risk assessments on our risk registers, our contingencies, etc. What if there is a second wave? What if that our number does go above where the government says we now need to go back to, level 4?
Yeah.
What does that mean? How is that going to impact?
I think you're right, Paul. I think that's really a serious consideration. And I think the other thing as well is staffing and resources for providers, because, what Barbara said was really interesting about AAT, because having worked at Babington in the past, and knowing how large their accountancy provision was, then if to be able to maintain social distancing, you're not going to be able to have the same number of people in a class. So does that mean you have to have more classes? Well, staff can only do so many classes at any one time. So what does that mean? And of course, if as there's the big fear that there are going to be massive redundancies, massive issues with apprenticeship starts going forward, if you don't have the starts, how can you fund it? And it's that, again, there's that other fine balance, isn't it? I'm not sure that we're ever going to go back to the way we were able to work before. I don't think that is ever going to be an option for us. I think there's going to be some positives we can take going forward. I think there's a lot that we can maybe do remotely, which is maybe means that we can cut down the amount of travel time that assessors have to do, and maybe cut down on overnight stays, which would then mean that we haven't got, as providers, you don't have that expense. So that then can maybe mean that you can channel that funding into somewhere else. But at the end of the day, there is only a certain amount of money that's available for each apprenticeship you're delivering. And it's how that is balanced in order to be able to then maintain all these new safety, if you like, requirements to be able to have all this social distancing and stuff. I'm really not sure we'll ever go back to where we were.
No, I agree with you completely. I think it's truly going to be a blended approach in the future, and it's never going to look as it used to. Because also we're getting a lot of feedback, like you said earlier, Paul, some learners are actually quite happy to have that blended delivery model. So actually, why would we want to get them all back in the classroom if actually half of them are quite happy with the sort of virtual model? So I think you're right. We're going to have to reassess what works for different cohorts, different employers, etc. It's going to be, quite exciting, I think, in some ways.
Yeah, potentially. I think you just made me smile with that comment then, Barbara, because when I did some observations of accountancy classes, it just reminded me that they didn't really like talking to each other anyway. So they probably are quite happy that they can do it online and they don't have to speak to anyone.
I know what you mean. They're just like looking at their numbers.
Yeah.
I think it is quite exciting. I think obviously different providers are at different stages. For us as an organisation, it was very much consolidation to begin with, making sure that we can support our existing learners in the best way possible, and developing those systems and that content and so on to be able to do that. And then I mentioned to Sue just before we started this session, we did our first full remote delivery on our AEB contract. It started on Monday this week, and already there's lessons learned and some teething problems with that, but a really good group that we're working with. So now we're building the confidence to be able to go forward with fully remote from, you know, beginning in terms of enrolment, initial assessment, etc., induction, and moving forward then into delivery. So that will give us confidence as an organisation. And then looking at apprenticeships, looking at our previous pipeline for apprenticeship starts, and trying to re-engage those employers and reignite those potential starts where appropriate. But I think the other positive, and what's quite exciting, I know it's at the early stages, and actually I was just listening to LBC Radio prior to starting this session, where they were covering again the statement made by Boris Johnson around an apprenticeship guarantee scheme. And I think that's one of a potential, very potential, and Lindsay, I don't know if you've got any insight in terms of what that could look like, but I think that could be a really positive step for the sector in terms of a real focus around apprenticeships and how apprenticeships can help support, in particularly young people. But actually, you know, we are likely to have mass unemployment as a result of this. We've already had announcements from the Chancellor that, you know, we will go into a severe recession as a result of this. So we're going to need programs that are going to help to absolutely, you know, stimulate the economy, but in supporting that stimulation, bring the skills and so on that are needed. And I think an apprenticeship guarantee scheme is one way of doing that, and is potentially really good news for the sector. Sorry, Lindsay, I think you're on mute.
Right. I think it's going to be some sort of program-led program. I think that's the only way you can do it, because if there's no jobs out there, you can't guarantee an apprenticeship. So it's got to be something where young people who are unemployed are put onto some sort of scheme, program-led, which we had before. And it worked quite well till we had a little hiccup in the system, but it did work quite well if we're going to go down that route, because we cannot guarantee young people a job. We don't even know what the area is going to look like out there, what business is going to be working, what businesses are actually going to be able to take on staff. So you could have all the incentives in the world, but businesses are going to, it's going to take lots of businesses a long time just to get back to any sort of normality over, you know, the coming period. So it's really good that they've acknowledged that something has to be done in the first place. I do think as a sector, we've got to give them a chance to put something together. So before something concrete comes out, as a sector, we must not let some organisations, individuals, put you down on it before you even started. Do you know what I mean? We've got to be positive. We know this isn't done. You know, you've only got to look at our own sector. Every day, we see people we work with for years looking for employment. Our own training providers, the people in the sector, know there's going to be a downturn. We know business is going to be downturn. We're going to have to build up slowly again. You know? And training providers I've spoken to, so they're not really worried about now. They're worried about 6 or 7 months' time of what's going to be happening, because they've got the apprentices on the system at the moment. You know what I mean? They're working with them. It's when these apprentices completed their apprenticeships and they've got to look for the next batch of apprenticeships. So yeah, that's my thoughts on it.
Yeah, and you're right. It's very, very early stages. I mean, a lot of conversation is taking place already, but from the Prime Minister making that statement last week, and it is very early stages. You're right, Lindsay, and there are too many unknowns at the moment. But I think you're right. It's a positive in the fact that it's been talked about, and I think I'm hoping that over the coming weeks and months on forums like this, you know, it will become more of a topic of conversation, and actually there'll be more to back it up in terms of what that's going to look like, and hopefully in the weeks and months to come, we'll have a better understanding of what the requirements are going to be as well.
You know how it's going to be paid for? Do you know what I mean? Who's going to pay for it? Is it going to be the levy? Are we going to transfer? You know what I mean? There's so many things, but I think let's give them a chance to put something together and not destroy it before we know anything. Do you know what I mean? Because as a sector, we're very good at the negative side. Let's be positive. They are going to put something together. Otherwise, you just all might as well shut up shop.
I agree, Lindsay. I think there is so much so much fear, so much uncertainty, so much that everybody's trying to deal with. It has been very challenging, very difficult times. It's not, when people do go back to some kind of normality, it's not going to be normal, but there's all the, you know, they're expecting mental health to go through the roof, as in a negative way. So I just think, you know, you're absolutely right. We need to be positive. We need to be forward thinking. At the end of the day, do we really have any choice? No, because this is the way it is. So it's pull the bootstraps up. What can we do to make it work, and get on with it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I do think as a sector we need to rethink how we think about things, because for the last couple of years, you know, if I was the business and I looked at any sort of some of the media and the headlines about our sector, I'd run a mile. You know, and we've got to change those thought processes that, yes, and you know, it's not just our sector, every single sector, every business in this country is going to struggle. You know?
And I think the apprenticeships sit across the whole piece. And if the people who deliver and support the apprenticeships are not being positive about what that can do for organisations, employers are not going to be positive about taking on apprenticeships.
No, because and we've got to look at how we actually present apprenticeships to employers. You know, I get phone calls, not for the last few months, but I would get phone calls every day. Have you thought about taking on an apprentice? Have you done this? Have you done that? I thought, have they even looked at my profile to see that I actually work in the sector? And I don't want, and you're being sold as cheap labour. The opening line from most people that give you a phone call is cheap labour. The whole sector needs a new approach, and it is selling. You are selling. A business development person, that's my background, is selling apprenticeships to an employer. We need a new way of actually getting out to businesses about the positive and how it can actually help that business coming out of this crisis in a positive way. And that's a re-education of business development people, in my opinion.
Well, maybe that's a future topic that we can focus on, Lindsay, going forward. It might be good to have some discussions around that and what that messaging needs to look like. I'm just conscious of time, everyone. Thank you very much for participating today. I've no doubt Erica will be back next week hosting. So thank you very much for all of you supporting me today as well.
Thanks.
So I will say goodbye. Stay safe, and I will see you next week.
Yeah, likewise. Stay safe, everyone.